Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Usually when we think about pharmacology, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, it's calculated. You get a specific diagnosis, you prescribe a targeted drug, you monitor the exact therapeutic level.
Exactly, it's clean. But then you step onto the clinical floor, you look at a patient's intake chart, and you see they are taking like an absolute tackle box of over-the-counter vitamin gummies and powders every single morning.
Yeah, and suddenly that precise pharmacological landscape becomes incredibly muddy.
Because patients often view these as completely harmless, right? They see vitamins as just a healthy part of a daily routine.
Which is dangerous, because they aren't just harmless snacks. They're biologically active compounds that can alter bodily functions, interact with prescription meds, and cause profound toxicity.
And that is exactly why we are here today. Welcome to a special review session of our deep dive tailored specifically for you, the college nursing student.
Because you are going to be encountering patients taking handfuls of these supplements every day.
Oh, absolutely. And your mission today is to master the science, not the marketing. We are pulling directly from Chapter 85 of Land's Pharmacology for Nursing Care, focusing strictly on vitamins.
We're going to break down how these compounds actually work in the body, the therapeutic goals, adverse effects, and the really critical nursing implications you need to know.
But to do that effectively, we have to start by cutting through the noise. I mean, with over half of U.S. adults spending like $3.5 billion a year on multivitamins, let's look at what the National Institutes of Health actually says.
Yeah, the NIH convened a panel of experts, and they concluded there is absolutely insufficient evidence to recommend multivitamins for preventing chronic disease in healthy people.
Wait, so they aren't buying a shield against chronic disease?
Not at all. The clinical data says no. The textbook actually provides a checklist, box 85.1, for when multivitamins are indicated. And the big exception is only for specific at-risk populations.
Right, like patients with alcohol dependence, pregnant individuals, or those with malabsorption disorders like Crohn's disease or post-bariatric surgery.
Exactly. But for your average healthy person, that daily pill is mostly just creating expensive urine.
Which means before we evaluate any individual drug, we need to establish the baseline terminology the chapter uses. So how does the text actually define a vitamin?
It gives us three main characteristics. First, it's an organic compound. Second, it's required in minute amounts for health. And third, and this is the one that really trips people up, it does not serve as a source of energy.
That is such a common trap. People think taking a B vitamin complex gives them energy in the same way eating a sandwich would.
Right, but it doesn't. Think of a vitamin not as the fuel in your car's gas tank, but as the spark plug.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, it's essential for the transformation of metabolic energy, but it is not the fuel itself. And many of these actually enter the body in an inactive form and require complex chemical conversions to even do their job.
Which brings us to the dosing rules. Let's decode the DRIs, the dietary reference intakes. The foundational number is the ER, right?
Yes, the estimated average requirement. That's the exact amount that meets the needs of 50% of healthy folks, just a statistical baseline.
And then from that, they calculate the RDA, the Recommended Dietary Allowance, which covers like 97 to 98% of healthy individuals.
Exactly. But if they don't have enough data to set the RDA, they use the adequate intake, which is basically an educated clinical estimate.
Okay, here's where I want to introduce an analogy for clinical practice regarding the UL, the Tolerable Upper Intake Level. If a patient sees a UL on a bottle, is that like a high score to aim for or a speed limit?
Oh, it is absolutely a speed limit. The UL is strictly an index of safety, not a recommended target.
So if they routinely ignore that speed limit, they are driving straight into toxicity.
Precisely. And how dangerous that toxicity becomes depends on our first major classification, how these drugs dissolve.
Right. Fat-soluble versus water-soluble. Let's detail the difference. The fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K.
And because they dissolve in lipids, they undergo massive storage in our fat tissues and liver.
Which is good for preventing deficiency, right?
Yes, but highly dangerous for toxicity. You can't easily excrete the excess. Water-soluble vitamins, on the other hand, like vitamin C and the B complex, have minimal storage.
So they require frequent ingestion because you just flush them out in your urine.
Exactly. So with those dosing rules established, let's look at the fat-soluble heavy hitters. starting with vitamin A or retinol.
Right. Its actions involve dim light adaptation and embryogenesis, but it's only indicated for deficiency.
Right. And the unit translation here is interesting. The text uses RAEs, retinol activity equivalents, versus older international units.
Why is that? I mean, why do provitamin A carotenoids, like the stuff in carrots, require 12 to 24 times higher doses than the retinol you get from animal products?
It comes down to absorption and conversion. Dietary carotenoids from plants are poorly absorbed by the gut, and then they have to be enzymatically clipped in half to become active retinol, which is highly inefficient.
Got it. Now, if a patient is deficient, the first sign is usually night blindness, right?
Yes, which can progress to xerophthalmia, a dry, thickened conjunctiva, and then keratomalacia, where the cornea actually degenerates.
But contrast that with toxicity or hypervitaminosis A. Chronic high doses cause severe liver injury. And what about the bones?
High doses actually stimulate osteoclasts, the cells that break down bone tissue, leading to bone disorders and a higher risk of hip fractures in adults.
Oh, wow. And we absolutely have to highlight the safety alert for pregnancy here. Vitamin A is highly teratogenic.
Yes, excessive intake causes fetal heart and skull malformations. Pregnant patients must absolutely not exceed the UL of 3,000 micrograms a day.
Critical nursing implication right there. Moving on to vitamin D, we'll keep it brief since it's covered deeply in Chapter 79.
Right. Its critical role is in calcium metabolism and preventing rickets and osteomalacia.
But I do want to note the National Academy of Medicine report cited in the text. Despite all the marketing, they state that claims for vitamin D beyond bone health remain completely unproven.
A good reminder to stick to the evidence. Which leads us to the remaining fat-soluble vitamins, E and K, where we hit some of the biggest misconceptions in supplement culture.
Oh, definitely. Let's talk about vitamin E, alpha-tocopherol, and box 85.2. It has no known role in metabolism, right?
None. It functions purely as an antioxidant.
Right, so here's the pushback. People think antioxidants are just harmless rust-proofing for the body. More is always better, right?
That is the antioxidant myth. The National Academy of Sciences actually found that high doses of vitamin E do not prevent chronic disease.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and it gets worse. High doses actually increase the risk of heart failure and hemorrhagic stroke.
Because it inhibits platelet aggregation, right? Like a mild blood thinner.
Exactly. There are 8 extra cases of hemorrhagic stroke per 10,000 people taking more than 200 IUs daily. It even blunts the beneficial effects of exercise on insulin sensitivity.
That is wild. So it's only indicated for hemolysis in premature infants and maybe delaying macular degeneration.
Right, though that high dose still carries the risks we just mentioned.
Okay, let's pivot to vitamin K, phytonadione. Its action is essential for synthesizing prothrombin and clotting factors, 7, I, X, and X.
And as a nurse, you have 2 main indications for it. First, it is the specific antidote for reversing warfarin overdoses.
Right, because warfarin blocks vitamin K. What's the second indication?
The newborn injection. Newborns are born with sterile intestines, so they lack the complete intestinal flora needed to synthesize their own vitamin K.
And the text mentions a dangerous trend here, right? Parents declining this prophylaxis.
Yes, and that refusal leads directly to life-threatening, completely preventable bleeding in infants.
That's tragic. Now, there's an administration alert in Table 85.3 for vitamin K. It notes a strict warning against IV administration. Why is that?
Because IV phytonadione can trigger severe anaphylaxis or cardiac arrest. You only use the IV route if other routes are totally impossible.
Got it. Okay, leaving the storage-heavy fat-soluble vitamins, we pivot to the water-soluble ones that just wash right out of the body.
Right, starting with vitamin C, ascorbic acid, famous for immune health, even though the evidence really doesn't support that.
To bust the myth for us, its actual action is needed for collagen and iron absorption, right?
Exactly. It's only indicated for scurvy, bleeding gums, poor wound healing. Massive doses do not cure the common cold or prevent cancer.
But there is a nursing implication for smokers, right? They require an extra 35 milligrams a day because of oxidative stress.
Yes, that's a key detail. Also, look at Table 85.4 for administration rules. IV Ascar requires precise dilution and immediate infusion.
And what happens if someone ignores the UL of 2 grams a day?
Severe GI irritation and diarrhea. It's an acid, after all. You're just dumping it into your intestines.
Yikes. Okay, let's move into the B complex. Niacin, vitamin B3, which is converted to NAD and NADP for cellular respiration.
And here's a clinical pearl. Niacin used to be prescribed in massive doses for cholesterol, but in 2016, it was removed from best practice guidelines.
Because the high doses caused more harm than good, right?
Exactly. Now, we mostly use it just to treat a deficiency called pellagra, which causes dermatitis, GI pain, and CNS dementia.
You often see pellagra in patients with alcohol use disorder or post-bariatric surgery. But if you're giving it, you have to watch out for the niacin flush, right?
Yeah, nicotinic acid causes massive vasodilation. The patient gets incredibly flushed, hot, and dizzy. That's why nicotinamide is often preferred. It avoids that side effect.
Good to know. Next is riboflavin, vitamin B2, used for deficiency issues like angular stomatitis, those cracks at the corners of the mouth.
And it's also used for migraine prevention.
But wait, if I take it for a migraine today, will it help right now?
Not at all. It's a tight timeline. It takes 400 milligrams daily for a full 3 months to see any prophylactic effects. But the good news is there's zero toxicity.
Okay, let's move deeper into the B complex, specifically focusing on 3 vitamins intimately tied to severe neurological damage.
Starting with thiamine, vitamin B1. It's a coenzyme for carbohydrate metabolism.
And a deficiency causes frank beriberi. There's the wet type, which is fluid and cardiac collapse, and the dry type, which is neuro and motor deficits like foot drop.
But the heavy nursing focus here is Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which we see in chronic alcohol consumption.
Right. The alcohol blocks thiamine absorption. What are the symptoms a nurse should look for?
Nystagmus, which is involuntary eye twitching, diplopia, and severe memory loss. It requires immediate IV or IM thiamine.
Immediate. Because if you don't catch it, that brain damage becomes totally irreversible.
Absolutely. Next is pyridoxine, vitamin B6, involved in amino acid metabolism. This one has a major drug-induced deficiency risk.
Isoniazid, right, the TB drug.
Yes, it prevents B6 conversion, so those patients need daily supplements to prevent peripheral neuritis.
But I want to flag a vital interaction from the text going the other way. B6 actually interferes with levodopa for Parkinson's disease.
That's right. And taking huge doses of B6 can actually cause its own neurologic injury, like severe ataxia.
Okay. Which brings us to cyanocobalamin, vitamin B12, essential for DNA synthesis. A deficiency here causes megaloblastic anemia,
where the red blood cells get huge and dysfunctional. And the specific mechanism often underlying this is pernicious anemia.
Because the patient loses gastric parietal cells, meaning there's no intrinsic factor, right?
Exactly. And without intrinsic factor, B12 physically cannot be absorbed in the gut.
And the symptoms aren't just the anemia. Emphasize the neurologic damage psychosis, ataxia, and glossitis.
Right. The nerve damage is profound. And that links directly to the next vitamin on our list, folic acid or vitamin B9.
Because folic acid is also for DNA and RNA synthesis. And the synthetic form is highly bioavailable, like 85%.
Yes. And just like B12, a folic acid deficiency also causes megaloblastic anemia.
Okay, so here is the vital clinical trap the text warns about, the danger of high doses of folic acid.
This is huge. Giving high doses of folate will actually fix the anemia caused by a B12 deficiency. The blood cells start dividing normally again.
Wait, so it fixes the B12 problem?
No, that's the trap. It fixes the blood cells, but it completely masks the underlying B12 deficiency.
Oh, so the irreversible neurological damage from the B12 deficit just silently progresses.
Exactly. You think the patient is fine, but their nerves are demyelinating. High doses also increase prostate cancer risk in older men.
But there is one absolute indication for folate. Pregnancy implications. Neural tube defects like anencephaly and spina bifida.
Yes, because the vulnerable window is days 21 to 28 post-conception. That's before most people know they're pregnant.
Which is why the USPSTF mandates 400 to 800 micrograms a day for all women capable of becoming pregnant. The FDA even mandated grain fortification to help hit this.
Right. To finish the B complex, we have pantothenic acid, B5, which makes coenzyme A, and biotin B7, which metabolizes carbs and fats.
Deficiencies for those are virtually non-existent outside of rare genetics, right?
True. But for biotin, we have to highlight a massive nursing implication, a serious safety alert.
Yes, the laboratory alert. Biotin supplements, like those hair and nail gummies, can severely interfere with testing technology.
It is a life or death issue. High doses of biotin can alter thyroid panels and, crucially, troponin tests.
Troponin is the biomarker for a heart attack.
Exactly. The biotin can chemically mask the troponin in the lab test, giving a falsely negative result.
So, summarizing the overarching theme of Chapter 85, it's really dismantling the more is better fallacy.
Correcting deficiencies is vital for newborns, pregnant patients, people with alcohol use disorder, but megadosing vitamins for general health is unproven and often dangerous.
So we want to leave you, the nursing student, with a scenario to ponder. Next time a patient comes into the ER with chest pain and their troponin is surprisingly negative, Will you remember to ask them if they take an over-the-counter hair and nail gummy?
A small question that could completely change their outcome.
Absolutely. Well, that's all for today from all of us here on the Last Minute Lecture team. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We wish you the absolute best of luck on your pharmacology exams and out there in your clinical rotations. You've got this.